Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode number 10 of the Believe in Serverless podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, this is the podcast that is for you and about you. This is where we cover all of the things that have happened in the last week in the Believe in Serverless community. We recap any unanswered questions, we talk about some of the highlights, and discuss some of the live streams that happened last week. Before we get into that, though, let's just thank the sponsors for today's episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Memento, the cutting-edge platform redefining real-time data management. Whether you're building high-performance gaming apps, media platforms, or enterprise-grade solutions, Memento has you covered with its ultra-fast, reliable services that scale effortlessly with your needs. Memento brings you services like topics and caches to build performant real-time applications. If you want to get started, head over to gomemento.com to learn more and get started for free, because in the world of real time, every single millisecond counts. Now, one thing, if this is your first time tuning in, we always like to start the podcast welcoming our new members. And things have been a little bit crazy the last week. We've now got 22 new members in the last week. If you've been listening to some of the other episodes of the show, there's normally 4 or 5 or 6, and that just shows the incredible growth we're getting in this community and so many people who are joining and we can all learn from. So instead of going through every single new member this week, we're just going to thank all of you who joined last week. Super excited to learn from you and hear what you've got to share, and instead jump straight into the content. And that's where I would like to welcome my co-host for this week's episode, Kawaja. Kawaja, what nice to have you here. This is the first time we've done this together, actually, isn't it?
Yeah, it is our first time. I was commenting earlier on how amazing your microphone is, and it's always nice to do a podcast with a pro. So I
Well, I
appreciate the
don't know about
opportunity.
that. I'll do my
Um,
best.
our community is really popping up. We have almost 900 members. We're one short of 900 members, and I think we will hit Ben Pyle's 1,000 number by middle of October at the rate that we're going. 22 members. I mean, that's insane. I think that might be one of our best weeks yet.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, when did the Discord actually start? Like, it wasn't a year ago, was it? It was after reInvent, I think,
No,
last year.
it
Yeah,
was after the reInvent party. I think it didn't actually start till like January
I wanted to say January.
of this
Yeah.
year. Yeah, our goal was to hit 1,000 members before reInvent, and I'm positive that we will.
Yeah.
And it's been nice because people are showing up. They're having open conversations. It's not exclusively about serverless only. People are having just deep technical
Mm.
conversations, and it's not exclusively about Amazon. It's not exclusively about anything. It's just a good community. So invite your friends. I think it's a really good place to just have good conversations and learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, every time I open Discord and I see there's some new notification inside the Believing Serverless, I'm like, yes, this is going to be something good. And even if I see a notification in like the security channel, like security isn't something I personally particularly spend a lot of time researching or doing work around. And even then, I'm like, there's always just some really fascinating stuff happening, fascinating conversations, different perspectives. Yeah, I just love it. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
And speaking of those, one of the great questions asked last week was Sam asked, does DynamoDB pull us away from evolutionary architectures of EDA by locking us into a restricted set of access patterns? When there's a need for data that your data model does not support, does it become a big hurdle? And it led to a really exciting and interesting discussion. James, you pointed out that it doesn't stop architecture from being evolutionary, and it's just an implementation detail. You can use different databases. You can use Neon for Postgres. You can use DynamoDB. They each have their own access patterns. I'd love to hear your take on this if you have things to add here too, James.
I mean, first and foremost, I will say, like, I love Dynamo. So I came from a DBA background. Well, I was a developer, and then I was a DBA, then I was a developer again with SQL Server. So I came from like a relational database mindset, and I thought I'd point out that bias just to get started. But then I read the DynamoDB book, Alex Debree's book, because I'm sure a lot of people working with Dynamo have, and it like completely changed how I viewed building modern applications. Like, it's just the pay-per-use bit model, the performance, the scalable performance, like, it's just incredible. But then actually, I do think to really get the most value from Dynamo, you need to be really specific about your access patterns. You need to know exactly how your data is going to be accessed so that you can structure it in the right way inside DynamoDB to be able to access it in that performant way. Otherwise, you end up doing scans everywhere, and that's no fun for anybody. And I think actually my views have kind of shifted more back towards the middle, I suppose, in a sense of I think it's easier to iterate in a relational database than it is inside Dynamo because you can more easily change your access patterns, change your query patterns, and particularly with services like Neon or Couchbase and some of these other more serverless relational databases. I actually think if I was getting started building something brand new today, I think I would start with something like Neon, something like Postgres, something relational, until I really understand exactly what my application is. And then I would potentially look at moving to Dynamo because I think Dynamo is a fantastic service. So that's kind of how I view that conversation. But then equally, there was a whole bunch of people in the chat saying they use Dynamo for the vast majority of the use cases, and it's perfect. Dynamo and S3 together are brilliant. So everything's trade-offs, isn't it? And I think the important thing I always think about coming back to Sam's questions is like, don't write your code in a way that locks you into a certain database provider. Have the right abstractions in your code base, whether that's ports and adapters or hexagonal architecture or whatever you want to call it, but have the right abstractions in place so that if you do need to change your database provider for whatever reason, it's not wholesale rewrites of everything.
I think the analogy I like to use is if you go on a racetrack and you can pick a car, but you still have to do the driving. You can't blame the car for every little problem. So I think what you said about some of this being implementation detail is a really valid point. Like, there's a lot of us that assume that if you pick the right database, all the problems will disappear. And it's just not true. The other part of it is databases have not sat stagnant over the last decade. A lot of great things have happened in the manageability of relational databases and how easily you can get access to them, as well as like some key developer productivity features inside of things like Neon and Postgres community in general. So the equation, like, one, I don't think you can ever say DynamoDB is the default selection for everything, because even if it was today, things might be different tomorrow. So you have to really start by looking at your application. And, you also have to look into like what you're comfortable with, but you need to just remember that the database choice isn't going to make the problems go away. You still need to be very, very deliberate about how fast you're making the turns. And when you break on a racetrack, like you still have to, drive the database. And you can do different things with different cars. So just pay attention to the implementation detail. Like you said, be aware of the actual data model so you learn how it's being used, and then make the selection of what the right database for your use cases might be.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most valuable things I got out of Alex's book, like this idea of starting from use cases, like starting from your access patterns as opposed to just like diving in. And something I've seen with like when I was at AWS, I've seen people do with Dynamo before is like, because it is NoSQL, it is a key value. You just can throw in any old stuff and Dynamo will just be like, thank you very much. And then you can change the schema and Dynamo will go, thank you very much. And it doesn't matter because you've not got the structure that you would have in a relational database. I think it's really easy to do really unperformant things. It's really easy to kind of do things wrong and build things in the wrong way if you don't really think deeply about them access patterns. So like you say, it is, I think, starting from them access patterns and moving forward from there is a good approach for any database, like you say.
And then Marco announced the release of Lambda Live Debugger. What do you think about that, James?
I mean, it only supports TypeScript. So as a .NET developer, I'm furious. No, I'm kidding, Marco. I'm kidding, Marco. It's awesome. I mean, I've seen tools like this kind of pop up in the past, like here and there. So the fact there's actually like a V1, like 1.0 release of this, I think it's a really cool idea, because at least for people getting started with serverless, one of the things I think when I first started working with serverless, because before that I was deploying .NET apps to Windows servers, right? So if I wanted to debug something, I'd just spin up Visual Studio, hit F5, and I've got the whole thing running locally. Whereas that local development experience isn't really as easy with serverless services when you've got, Lambda connected to SQS, connected to SKNS, connected to DynamoDB to try and emulate that whole thing locally is really difficult. So the common thing you hear often, and I would say, is with serverless applications, you want to be testing in the cloud. But then when you're testing completely remotely, debugging becomes more difficult. I can't just set a breakpoint inside my Lambda function in AWS, and then you lose that thing that a lot of developers are familiar with locally. So having this ability to connect a debugger to a live Lambda function, I think is a really interesting idea in terms of, okay, I can actually step through my Lambda function code and also test IAM roles, the way it integrates with Dynamo, the way it integrates with SQS or whatever else it is, because it is kind of running in the cloud but debugging locally. So I think it's a great idea. What about you?
I love it. I mean, I think when I was a developer, I come from the Java world, and I remember debugging my web application archives. Like Tomcat was the web server of choice back then, and you'd run it, and you can do only so much in your development environment, in your laptop or whatever it might be. But once in a while, you do need to run it on the actual server. And the day I learned about Java remote debugging, it changed my life. Like, I was able to solve production issues that I, in like 1/10 of the time. Now, this is with JavaScript, but this is beautiful because there are things that might not be like apparent to you on your laptop, local Lambda environment, that you just need to see once in a while running inside an actual Lambda. So I think it's going to be a game changer. I wish it was available in other languages, but it's a start, and I think it's a good way for Amazon also to refine and polish the overall user experience of remote debugging before this becomes available in other languages. .NET also, I assume, has some remote debugging capabilities, right?
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that they'll build that in. I'm curious, as a history question, James, so a couple of years ago, Amazon launched Snap Start at reInvent. That was only for Java. And now we see this for JavaScript. I'm curious, has there been anything that has been Lambda but for .NET first?
Not Lambda specific. There's a whole thing that the .NET SDK team built at AWS called the Lambda Annotations Framework, which is a way of basically, if you've got a Lambda function that takes something from API Gateway, for example, you can just add a little annotation on your method in your .NET code. And then .NET's got this idea of, it's got this thing called source generation, where you can you can generate C# code from templates. So what the .NET SDK team did is you could annotate your method in .NET with a Lambda function attribute, and then you could say it's a post request from API Gateway and the body is an order.
Oh, wow.
And then it'd use source generators to auto-generate all of that boilerplate, like all the API Gateway, parsing the request, checking the path parameters, all that stuff. It just auto-generates all of that. So it's not really Lambda first, but it is some really cool stuff that the .NET team added to kind of simplify the programming model of Lambda, so that you're just saying, I've got this method, it receives an order, and it comes from an API request, and the rest will just get auto serialized and deserialized in and out. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, there's nothing Lambda first. I'm still waiting for Snap Start on Lambda, but I can't see that. Snap Start for .NET, should I say? But I'm not sure how soon that will arrive, given the .NET usage on Lambda. But that would be super cool.
Fair enough. Speaking of .NET, we had Azure, a discussion on Azure Container Apps and how it does container management and service discovery. Are you do you have any sense of how that compares with the AWS ecosystem and any insights there?
Yeah, so this is a question that I actually posed. So I've been trying out Azure Container Apps a little bit over the last week, and actually one of the really, really good things that Azure have done is they've integrated Azure Container Apps with a service called Dapr. I don't know if you've heard of Dapr, the Distributed Application Programming Runtime. It's an open source project. So Azure Container Apps and Azure Functions, for that matter, which is the Azure FAS, Functions as a Service, they integrate with Dapr. And what Dapr does is it gives you really easy ways to do things like service discovery, PubSub. So inside your application code, you just want to say, I want to send a request to orders, the orders service. And Dapr handles all the wiring up of where the orders service is, what it actually is. So you configure all of that at like a container apps level. So inside your container apps environment, you say this environment uses Dapr. And then when your service starts up, it registers itself as the orders service or the payment service or the loyalty service. So in your code, you're just saying, I want to send a request to the orders service. So it kind of has service discovery built in, if you will. It has pub sub built in. So in your application code, you just want to, you say, I want to publish a message, and your application code doesn't care about the transport layer. Dapr does. So in your environment, in your container apps environment, you would say, I want to use Azure Service Grid, and all the routing, everything else is handled outside of your application code. So it's a really cool, I think Azure Container Apps coupled with that, and Azure Functions is integrated with all of this as well. So you could have publish to a queue, and then that would then wire into your Azure function using Dapr. So I think it's, I don't know, I think when I compare it with like the AWS serverless container orchestrators, I think they've got a bit of a leg up simply for the developer experience. Like everything is more glued together. I wanted to add open telemetry. Obviously, I'm at Datadog now. I wanted to turn on Datadog. There's just a tick box in the UI to turn on open telemetry for an entire environment. You
Wow.
put in your Datadog API key, and then the OpenTelemetry endpoint gets auto-injected into all of your containers as an environment variable, and then it just works. You've just got stuff in Datadog, and it's just configured in the UI, and that's that for that whole environment. So I think just from a developer experience perspective, they've kind of thought about a lot more. Ingress is just built in. You don't need to have an ALB. It's just built into the cert. Like there's just all these things where I think it's a much more complete service, as opposed to like AWS, where you need to kind of wire together all the different building blocks. You need to kind of get your ALB, and then get Fargate, and then get ECS, and then maybe you need service cloud map. Is it kind of what the service discovery service is called in AWS to wire everything together? So that's been my impressions so far of looking at Azure and how Azure do container things.
The other thing with Dapr, as I recall, it allows a lot of different, we were talking about .NET support inside of AWS, but like Dapr in general supports a lot of different languages. So you can create these meshes across a variety of languages, I assume, and create services together regardless of, what language they were each written in. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from memory, there's like .NET. I mean, all the major runtimes: .NET, Java, Python, Node, Rust. I think there's a Go SDK, maybe even a PHP
Wow.
SDK.
Yeah.
And so I guess if anyone's interested, it functions like a sidecar. So you'd have a Dapr sidecar running next to your actual application container. So your actual application is just communicating on localhost in essence. And then the sidecar manages all that service registration, all of that other stuff. So if you're looking at your like traces in OpenTelemetry, you'll see HTTP requests to like 127.0.0.1, and it's like, oh, what's that? And then that's where all the magic happens. So, yeah, it's really cool, and it makes it really easy. Like so locally, if I'm developing locally, I can just run things with Dapr, and it uses Redis for most of the things internally, like the pub sub and then I deploy it, and my application code doesn't change at all. I just change the configuration in that environment, and I say actually in production, pub sub is going to use SQS instead of Redis. And then I run it locally, deploy it to production. It's the same application code, and you just sub out the actual configuration, which is quite an interesting model, I think.
Wow. That's really cool. We also saw, moving forward, the a discussion on RUM, real time or real user management, typically requiring front end instrumentation for effective metrics collection. I'm curious if you have thoughts on PII data or any sensitive data, and like what your thoughts are on implementing it securely.
So yeah, it's an interesting one. So I've never done an awful lot of front end development, but I think this is a really interesting conversation. Both this idea of real user monitoring, of like monitoring how users actually interact with the front end of an application, but then also you've got the trade on. And the question that came up in Discord, the discussion was around like, if you're tracking exactly what users are doing inside your UI, is that is that a good thing? I'm not so sure. I mean, do you Memento or anything like that? Did any kind of like monitoring in
No, we don't.
in
We
that?
don't have that. Yeah, we don't have that quite built in. But any type of tracking that happens, there's a nice amount of like anonymization
Yeah,
that you can do if you just want to learn user behaviors. Like if you want to, kind of do statistics on people who click on cache are more likely to make a buying decision than people who click on topics, whatever like hypotheses you might have. It's quite straightforward to anonymize. I think what you want to do with RUM usually is to get deeper insights about the user's journeys and where they might be struggling. And a lot of that is not impacted if you just anonymize. Some of it is, but like most insights you can get by anonymizing and aggregating the data as opposed to looking at what user specifically did what action.
Yeah. And I think Ben Pyle actually did a blog post on this last week, but I think it gets really interesting as well when you start to be able to link your front end into your back end, like to get distributed tracing. And shameless plug, of course, that Ben's article was on Datadog, but the ability to be able to, like, look at your front end application and monitor that right through into the actual back end services that front end application talks to with distributed tracing, and being able to link all that stuff together. And with your point about anonymization, like from a back end perspective, it's probably enough information to know that James Eastham is customer ID 1265439, and being able to correlate that customer ID across all the requests is probably enough for most purposes. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting. I mean, I've never done enough front end development to be able to see how that will be useful. I try and avoid it at all costs, to be honest, because I'm a terrible. Mostly, my brother's a designer. My brother works in user experience. So anytime I try and do anything with any UI or CSS, he's like, "That's just horrible. Like, stop it. Stop trying." So, I learned early I'm not very good at design.
I feel the same way. I try to stay away from the front end because I'm not good at it.
No. I tuned into Alan and Andres' live stream on Friday that we'll talk about in a little bit. And all I heard Andres said was something like, "I never know how to center a div," or something like that. And I'm like, yes, I can relate. How do you make a div appear in the middle of a screen? I do not know.
That feels like it needs to go on a t-shirt.
Yeah, that's exactly. And then, but it needs to be like offset on the t-shirt, wouldn't it? Like, it needs to be like on your shoulder or something, and then it would say like, "How I need to know how to center a div." Yeah, that'd be the one.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, for anyone who's this is your first time listening, what we normally do after we've been through some of the interesting discussions in the last week is talk about some unanswered questions that happened in the community. And most weeks there aren't that many unanswered questions, which I actually think is a really good sign. Like, when this section's really short, I really like it. But there was a question this week that I think actually followed on from our earlier DynamoDB conversation, or maybe it was me actually asking about data transfer formats. But anyway, this was a question from Tycho, which was, how many of the data transfer formats are supported by the majority of AWS services and patterns? Thinking like Athena, CloudWatch Login, DynamoDB, Doors switch. Is CloudWatch Logging, DynamoDB imports is switching to something like Protobuf going to be plug and play with everything? Because I think most of the AWS services are JSON. They play with JSON, don't they? Like Lambda events, other things like that. So, I mean, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that from your experience working with things like Dynamo on formats around JSON or Protobuf, or any benefits or trade-offs of using any of the other data transfer formats, I suppose, Kawaja.
I think we're going to come full circle and talk about how the implementation details and understanding your data models matters a lot. If you're using Dynamo as a key value store, meaning that all you do is you say, here's my hash key or my primary key, and I just want to get the whole item, then the attributes can actually be noise and an extra burden, the specific attributes, because what Dynamo and most NoSQL databases will do is every item is going to repeat the name of every single attribute inside of it on every row of the table, and that's wasteful. It's wasteful on storage. It's wasteful on the network that needs to go through, and a lot of people, even if they're just doing key value lookups, they will have like 100 different attributes inside the item. And a really nice way to optimize the hell out of that by being aware of your data access patterns is just use protobufs and use the binary capability, like put the whole thing inside a binary attribute inside of Dynamo. Now, this slows you down, and it's not necessarily the fastest, and you lose out on a bunch of features like GSIs and query with filters and all that. But if you're not using those, it is much faster. You can save on IOPS costs. You can save on storage costs. You can, improve the hell out of your performance. So at Momento, we use Dynamo for as many things as we can, to like our control planes and how we store data in S3 and so forth. Like we just, use protobufs internally. and we store the entire item as a protobuf. And protobufs are beautiful. So as a performance optimization and cost optimization, those are incredible once you understand your data patterns. Unfortunately, protobufs aren't like one of the cross-service supported formats, because it's hard. Everybody can have its own schema. At the end of the day, the protobuf is essentially akin to your schema of the table in a relational database, right? So at the end of the day, you still got to get in that race car and drive around the track. You still got to turn. You still got to brake. Either way. But it's the implementation detail, and I think Protobuf is a really good implementation optimization that's available to you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you make if you've got like a really, I guess, wide item, for lack of a better word, and the chances of even if you are using GSIs, like you could plug the GSIs into their own attributes, like GSI
That's
1,
right.
GSI 2 as like, the single table design would point you towards, and then just store the rest of the item as binary. Like, I mean, I can think of a bunch of trade-offs like DynamoDB streams and all that kind of stuff. But I think, like you say, if you've got really wide items, it feels like a really good optimization to, yeah. I mean, I think what prompted this whole discussion was me in Discord asking about, I think, in event-driven architectures, the schema of your event is difficult to manage. Like if you need to change the schema of the event you're publishing and you've got no idea who your downstream consumers are, then would Protobuf be a good data transfer format for event-driven architecture? It's more of like a theoretical question, I suppose. And I do think it's a particularly interesting one, because a lot of them, I think my understanding of Protobuf is that it has like backwards compatibility built in. Like it just supports backwards compatibility. So I think in the same situation, like if you aren't going to use all them attributes, if you've got like a massive, thick event that you're publishing, is there an argument to serializing it into binary and publishing the binary representation and then just sharing the schema as a .proto file? Maybe. I don't know. It's an
I
interesting
mean, JSON is incredibly verbose and very bloated, if you will. And the intent of it was to make it human readable. But like with event-driven architecture, you realize that it's not the humans that are reading the data, it's machines. And machines understand schema. So, but again, like Protobuf will speed up your performance. They may slow down your development, because you got to be a little bit more methodical and really make sure that you're doing the backwards compatibility and upgrading the schema. We find the trade-off to be worth it. And when we built the Memento protocol, even like it's all Protobuf based, instead of being JSON based, for that specific reason.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that was the only unanswered question that we had. And as every single thing we ever discuss in software, it depends, as always. There we go. We got it in there. So what we like to do after the unanswered questions is to actually have a look at some of the live streams. So every week in the Believe in Serverless community, we get experts in, people in the community, people who are building cool things, to come and talk about the things that they're building. They get live streamed. And then in this podcast, we review the live streams. So the first live stream we had last week was, I think, an absolute legend of the serverless world, actually, I think is the only real way to put it. We had Sheen Brisals so we've got a clip of Sheen talking now. So let's flick over to that and then we'll be back in a second.
First principle thinking is the thought process of breaking things down into the fundamental elements. And when we get to that level, it will help us innovate the solutions to build. And in that case, serverless is just a technology enabler. That's how we should see the adoption of serverless and the so-called the serverless first idea. Now, what are the first principles that you can think of? For example, domain-driven design, domain first. Before you start serverless, you think in terms of splitting and organizing your organization domains. And then the team first comes in. APIs, microservices, event-driven. Then bring serverless in. You may be thinking that, security first or DevOps first, test first. Yes, fine. Bring them in as an and where they fit.
I mean, I'm a big fan of first principle thinking, just generally. And I like this idea of thinking about things. What do you want to bring in first, and what's the right thing to bring in first? Particularly talking about this idea of serverless first. I think the serverless world is in a bit of flux at the minute, isn't it, with terms of what serverless actually means. And I think one of the ways I've started thinking about this is like this idea of serverless first, or the serverless spectrum. Like, what is the most serverless you can be, and then step out from there. But I've never really thought about it in the way Sheen describes it there, in terms of like domain-driven design first, or team first, or event-driven first. Like, what is the right first for you to think about?
Yeah, and I think it's, I think going back to it depends, we're learning as a community, as a society, that you can't be zealots about anything. And it's so much of it is implementation details, right? And I think I love the first principles approach as well. And you can't, you can't start by assuming that a technology that you love and care about is the answer. I think it really depends on your application. You got to start with your service goals and your customer aspirations first, and then make a decision and evaluate the technologies that are available to make, to serve your customers the best.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I found myself saying quite a lot when I think I've gone a bit far from like the far serverless for everything spectrum back to kind of the middle area over the last couple of years. And I think one of the things I used to say was like, your customers don't care about how well your Kubernetes cluster can scale. Equally, your customers don't care about how fast your Lambda functions can scale. Like, your customers do not care about the implementation details, do they? Like, I think it's a realization. It's kind of that curve I think that everybody goes through. Like, you see this new thing and it's like, this thing's amazing, and then you kind of reset and you're like, actually there's a use case for everything. There was a really good heuristic I at reInvent a couple of years ago, maybe last year actually, shared internally at AWS, and it was this idea that if your ability to dynamically scale and operate infrastructure is something that's going to differentiate you from your competitors, then Kubernetes can be a really good fit. So, for example, Datadog internally uses a lot of Kubernetes because scaling up, scaling down to receive all the data that Datadog receives in dynamically and process it, it's quite useful to be able to dynamically scale up specific instance types dynamically. But if you're building, I don't know, like an internal HR application that your internal HR applications team's going to use, then, like you say, your use case is very different. Your customers are very different. Their requirements and needs are very different. Start from that and choose the right thing that will fit their needs, as opposed to going off and building with serverless or Kubernetes or on premises or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to go.
Yeah, always. So the second live stream we had last week was Alan and Andres building a Disney princess quiz, which for me, as I am a big Disney fan, I will confess. I do love Disney. My girlfriend's never watched a Disney film, which is frankly inexcusable if you ask me. But, so this one I was particularly interested in because it's they were trying to build an app to a quiz about Disney princesses. So let's see what Andres and Alan got up to.
The big thing for me here, like the big takeaway, is how fast that was. Not necessarily for building it, but how fast that operation is. Like, let's think about this. In the second and a half that it took to do that page load, it was saving our answer to a Memento cache. It was invoking a Lambda function. It was pulling that value out of the cache. It was loading a full conversation history out of the cache. It was querying an LLM. It was then subsequently saving everything that we've done back into the cache, generating that HTML, and then serving it, and then rendering in a second and a half. That's wow.
Before we go any further, and if you're listening to the audio version of this, I would recommend just briefly going to look at the video version. Can we fully appreciate Andres and Alan's commitment to these live streams? Because Alan's wearing a tiara in that video, and Andres has got a whole bunch of dresses, Disney princess dresses behind him. I just love the commitment to the themes.
I'm curious if they're Andres's or if they're his kids. Right now, I really want to see Andres dressed as a Disney princess at reInvent this year.
I'm not sure if I do or I don't, but maybe. That's one for the party, Andres. Andres, if you're listening, then that's a request from Kawaj and me. Anyway, back to the topic of what they were actually talking about. I think it's a really, really cool. I mean, at least my experience working with Memento, I've had a very similar experience, like super easy to work with. I think I did a live stream a few weeks ago where I added Memento to a Java application that I was building, like a demo application I have on GitHub, and before I turned Memento on, you could see the graph of like the latency, and I had a Memento and it was like the graph dropped to 0. It was like it just flatlined completely because the performance got so fast. And I think when you start coupling that with all the different things that modern applications need, like usually expect fast performance, don't they? Usually expect things to load so quickly. To be able to, there's so much stuff you can do now so quickly. It's quite impressive. Memento, the LLMs that Alan was talking about as well.
Yeah, I found what Alan was saying to be a testament for the efficacy of event-driven architecture, because with the event-driven architecture, you have lots of little steps that you have to go through. And, I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect that the 1.5 second that he talked about, probably 1.4 of that was the LLM. And that's going to get much faster, right?
Yeah.
But it is ridiculous how many, how quickly Lambdas execute, how quickly you can persist data, and how you can go through so many steps faster than it takes, my physical laptop to connect over to the Wi-Fi and into the data center. So the lower latency across the board for these systems is really making it possible to do really rich applications with event-driven architectures in ways that are imperceptible to the end user from a latency perspective. I found that to be fascinating. Like that list that Alan rambled through was a long list. I mean, there's a lot that happens in that end-to-end demo that they built.
Yeah. I think it's one of the common misconceptions, isn't it, with like asynchronous systems in general, is that if you start doing event-driven systems, you start doing messaging, it immediately means your system's going to be less performant. And yeah, I think, like you say, it's becoming less and less of a thing. It always blows, but sometimes I just sit and think about, like, whenever I think about like Lambda, the internals of Lambda and how it works, and I think about the fact when a request comes in, an environment's being started up on a VM somewhere, your code's being downloaded, a runtime's being loaded, the code's being initialized, the request's being handled, and then that's happening in 600 milliseconds, and that's a problem. I'm like, look at the engineering effort that's happening behind that. Like, it's so impressive. So impressive. And I'm sure, all the other, I've been doing a lot of work with Cloudflare recently. That's exactly the same. Like the performance they
With
get
workers.
out of Cloudflare, it's like staggering when you think about the scale of it. The number of requests that are being received, the scale of things behind the scenes, it's all super impressive stuff.
It's really fascinating. That's why just the engineering, like Lambda is an engineering marvel. This is why I love reading everything that Mark Brooker writes, because he spent a lot of his time on Lambda, and a lot of his lessons are applied there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode, this week's podcast. Coming up this week, we've got a couple of live streams happening. So on Wednesday, we have the second round of the Serverless Jeopardy game show. So the second episode of that is coming on Wednesday. And then on Friday, Andres and Alan are going to be building a judgmental RSS feed. What that means, I am not sure. Alan messaged me earlier and said, we're building a judgmental RSS feed that shares technical articles from the BIS Discord. There it is verbatim from Alan's message. So tune in if you want to learn what a judgmental RSS feed is. I have my own views, but let's see what happens on Friday. And this month is also part of Data Month. So throughout the rest of this month, we've got a few other talks. Alex Debris is going to be on talking about NoSQL, Pete Naylor, and some stuff from Memento as well. I think there's people on from Memento talking this month as well. So if you're interested in any of the things coming up in the community, if the kind of conversations that me and Kawaja have had today, all these things are happening inside the Discord. We are just relaying them out and talking about the things that happened. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, you're interested in serverless, you're interested in just technology in general, I'd really encourage you to check out the community. There'll be links in the show notes to join, links to all the things that me and Kawaja have talked about. And finally, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Kawaja, for joining today and co-hosting this episode with me. It's always fun to chat. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you.